The calm before the storm. The Deathworlders had always been a peaceful race. Their planet, a harsh and dangerous place, had shaped them into strong, resilient beings who could survive almost anything. Despite their power, they had never sought conflict. Instead, they chose to live in peace with the galaxy. Their reputation was that of calm giants. Across the stars, other species feared their strength, but they had never used it. Instead, they focused on building alliances, sharing knowledge, and spreading peace wherever they went. Many avian species looked up to them as an example of what true strength was, strength not used for violence, but for helping others. The Deathworlders lived by a simple belief: power should be used wisely. They understood what it was like to struggle, to fight for survival every day, and they did not want to impose that on others. They were patient, often waiting for others to come to them for help. They believed in cooperation over conflict, and that's how they had managed to live for so long without enemies. The leader of the Deathworlders, a tall and powerful figure named Kale, was known for his calm demeanor and wise decisions. He had led his people through many difficult times, always choosing the peaceful path. Kale was the embodiment of the race's ideals: strong, silent, and endlessly patient. But that patience was about to be tested. It started with a distress signal, a warning from one of their colonies on a distant moon. The message was short, but it was enough to make the hearts of the Deathworlders skip a beat. "We are under attack. The enemy is unstoppable. We need help. Please hurry." The message was from the small colony of Zephyr 9, a peaceful settlement that had been established years ago. The Deathworlders had helped the people of Zephyr 9 build their homes and protect their lands from natural disasters, but they had never expected something like this. The enemy they faced was unlike anything the Deathworlders had encountered before. The attackers were not another species seeking to expand their empire. No, they were something darker: brutal raiders from a distant, war-torn sector of the galaxy. The raiders were known for their cruelty, their ability to destroy entire worlds without remorse. They were feared by all, and now they had set their sights on the Deathworlders. Kale stood in the council chamber, staring at the message. His mind raced. Should he send reinforcements to Zephyr 9, or should he wait and see if the colony could hold its own? He knew that the Deathworlders were capable of defending themselves, but sending too many troops could spark a larger conflict, one that could pull them into a war they were not ready for. The peaceful race had never been involved in intergalactic warfare. Kale's advisor, Lyra, a brilliant strategist, stepped forward. She had always been the one to see things from a different angle. "Kale," she said softly, "we can't ignore this. If we don't act now, they might destroy the colony. And if they succeed, they will only become bolder. They will strike again, and next time it might be our home." Kale nodded slowly, his eyes darkening. He had known this day would come. The galaxy was full of dangers, and they could no longer avoid them. Their reputation for peace had made them targets. The Deathworlders had been kind to all who crossed their path, but kindness had its limits. The raiders had crossed that line. "I'll call for a meeting," Kale said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to discuss our options." The council room quickly filled with the leaders of the various Deathworld clans. The Deathworlders were not a single unified government, but a collection of tribes and clans, each with its own leader. Kale was the overall leader, but he always consulted the others before making a major decision. As the council members took their seats, Kale addressed them. "The colony on Zephyr 9 is under attack. We've received a distress signal. The enemy is too strong for our forces to handle without drawing attention. I need your advice. Should we act now, or should we wait?" The room fell silent as the leaders exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew the importance of this decision. If they intervened, they would be revealing themselves as warriors, not peaceful guardians. The galaxy had always viewed them as protectors, not fighters. To take up arms would change everything. One of the leaders, a fiery warrior named Vorm, stood up. His people had always been the most battle-ready of the clans, and he was not known for his patience. "We should strike back," he said, his voice filled with anger. "The time for diplomacy is over. These raiders won't stop until they have destroyed us. We can't let that happen. We need to show them that the Deathworlders are not to be underestimated." Another leader, a calm and measured figure named Eliana, disagreed. "We can't afford to be hasty. If we attack now, we risk becoming just another warlike race. We have built a reputation as peaceful beings, and that is what sets us apart. If we lose that, we will never get it back." Kale listened carefully to both sides, weighing the consequences of each decision. He knew the galaxy had always seen the Deathworlders as different, a race of strength that chose peace over violence. But now the world was changing. The raiders were not going to stop until they had taken everything from the Deathworlders. Kale felt the weight of the decision resting on his shoulders. As the council continued to argue, Kale's mind drifted back to the distress signal from Zephyr 9. He thought about the people there, the families, the children, the settlers who had trusted the Deathworlders to keep them safe. He couldn't let them down. The calm before the storm was over. The Deathworlders were about to make a choice that would change their future forever. "We fight," Kale said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We protect our people, no matter the cost." And so the peaceful Deathworlders prepared for war, an unlikely decision. The council room grew tense as Vaughn's words hung in the air. The other leaders shifted uncomfortably, but Kale remained calm, his eyes scanning the faces of his people. He had always believed that peace was the only way, that the Deathworlders' strength lay not in their ability to destroy, but in their refusal to become like the very enemies they fought. But Vaughn's words struck a chord. The galaxy was not kind, and maybe, just maybe, the time had come to show that they could fight as fiercely as they could love. "We've spent centuries building our alliances," Kale said, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of doubt behind his words. "But this is different. If we respond with violence, we risk everything. We risk becoming the very thing we've always feared." Lyra, ever the voice of reason, leaned forward. "Kale is right. We've always had power, but we've chosen to use it wisely. If we strike now, we may be caught in a cycle of endless conflict. Once we start, there's no going back." Vaughn's eyes flashed with a fierce light. "That's just it, isn't it? We've been too passive. While we've waited, others have grown stronger, bolder. These raiders have shown no mercy, and they won't stop unless we make them." He glanced at Kale. "If we don't act now, the galaxy will see us as weak." Kale met Vaughn's gaze, and for the first time in years, he questioned his own beliefs. Was he holding on to an ideal that no longer served his people? Were they really weak for refusing to fight, or was it just fear of what they might become? Lyra added, "What if we did something different? Not just fight, but send a message. We show them that we've had enough, not as conquerors, but as defenders. We don't want to destroy them, but we can make them understand that we won't stand by any longer." The silence that followed was heavy. Every leader knew what that meant. To send a message was to risk everything. It was a gamble, one that might change the fate of their entire race. Kale took a deep breath. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. He could feel the eyes of his people on him, waiting for him to make the final call. He had led them with wisdom, but now wisdom seemed like a luxury. The time for thinking was over. The time for action was at hand. He stood tall, his voice commanding. "We'll act, but not like they expect. We'll strike fast, hard, and precise. We won't start a war, but we'll make sure they know that attacking us has consequences. We'll protect Zephyr 9, but we'll do it in a way that ensures they never forget what happens when they challenge the Deathworlders." The council murmured in agreement. Vaughn's fierce smile was matched by the nods of the other leaders. The decision had been made. But even as Kale gave the orders, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. What if this was the beginning of the end? The Deathworlders quickly prepared for the mission. Their ships, sleek and formidable, were ready to depart. The warriors suited up, not in full battle armor, but in tactical gear designed for a quick, effective strike. They weren't looking for a long, drawn-out war. They needed to show their strength in a way that would leave the raiders shaken, not destroyed. As they traveled towards HFY, Cal's mind raced. Was this the right choice? What would they become if they crossed this line? He'd heard the stories, the warnings from the old elders. Once you taste blood, you can never turn back, they said. Once you take a life, it changes you. You'll see enemies everywhere. But Cal had always believed in the strength of his people to control their actions. They were not animals. They could fight without becoming monsters. HFY came into view, a small moon surrounded by a vast field of asteroids. The raiders had already begun their attack, their ships large and menacing, pouring fire down onto the colony below. The peaceful settlers were helpless, and the distress signals were growing weaker. Cal's heart pounded in his chest as he gave the order to drop out of hyperspace. Their ships emerged from the blackness of space, moving like shadows across the stars. It was time to show the raiders that the Deathworlders were not to be underestimated. Deploy the forces, Cal commanded. His voice was calm, but the weight of the decision was heavy in his chest. This wasn't just about saving a colony anymore. This was about sending a message to anyone who thought the Deathworlders were soft. The ground shook as their ships touched down on the surface of HFY. The raiders, initially caught off guard by the sudden arrival of reinforcements, hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Cal led the charge, his people following closely behind. They didn't roar in anger or run into battle with reckless fury. Instead, they moved with precision, their every step measured and deliberate. They weren't here to destroy, but to assert their dominance, to show that the galaxy's most peaceful race was no longer willing to be pushed around. The first raider ship exploded in a burst of fire, and the raiders scrambled to react, but it was too late. The Deathworlders were already inside their camp, and they fought with a quiet, deadly efficiency. They disabled the raider ships one by one, knocking out their communication systems, cutting off their escape routes. But even as they fought, Cal couldn't shake the thought that had been haunting him. This battle was only the beginning. The first strike. The moment their boots hit the cracked surface of HFY, a cold silence swept over the battlefield. The raiders, initially caught off guard by the sudden arrival of the Deathworlders, hesitated for just a split second. But in that brief pause, Cal's forces moved swiftly, silent and lethal. Their training was flawless, their movements smooth and precise. This was not an all-out war. This was a surgical strike, a statement that they would not stand by while others suffered. The raiders' ships were scattered across the moon's surface, their massive engines still sputtering as they attempted to regroup. The Deathworlders had no intention of letting them escape. Cal had ordered a quick, overwhelming strike to ensure their enemies understood the power of a race that had long been underestimated. As Cal watched the chaos unfold from his command center, his mind raced. The battle was swift, brutal, and precise. His forces, composed of the most skilled warriors, tacticians, and engineers, moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. They had come to defend the colony, but what they were really doing was sending a message. They were showing the galaxy that the Deathworlders were no longer passive, no longer content to be the silent guardians of peace. They were showing their enemies that they had claws, and those claws were sharper than anyone had realized. Cal could hear the sounds of distant explosions through the communications channel. His heart didn't race with excitement or bloodlust. Instead, there was a cold clarity in his chest. This was necessary. The raiders had to know that their actions had consequences, and the Deathworlders were going to make sure they never attacked another peaceful colony again. Lura's voice crackled over the comms, bringing him back to the present. Cal, they're regrouping. We have to be careful. We can't let them escape. Cal's mind shifted into tactical mode. The raiders weren't the sort to back down easily. They were relentless, trained for war, and they would retaliate with everything they had. But the Deathworlders had an advantage. They didn't fight with rage or revenge. They fought with precision, patience, and an understanding of strategy that most other species couldn't match. Understood. No mercy. Pin them down. Within moments, Cal's warriors began to encircle the remaining raider forces. The raiders had underestimated the Deathworlders' ability to adapt. They thought they could overwhelm the colony with sheer force, but they had no idea what they were up against. The Deathworlders didn't just fight. They planned, they calculated, and they moved like shadows through the dust and wreckage. One of the raiders' leaders, a brutal-looking figure with sharp tusks and glowing red eyes, began barking orders to his troops, rallying them to make a final stand. He had seen the Deathworlders' power firsthand, but it only fueled his rage. He would not retreat, not after the damage they had done. The raider leader's voice crackled through the static, and Cal's face hardened when he heard it. "You think you can scare us with your toys, Deathworlders? We have faced worse than you. You're just another obstacle to crush beneath our boot." Cal didn't respond. There was no need for words. The time for talking was over. The Deathworlders' warriors moved in, and the raiders were forced into a defensive formation. They had nowhere to retreat, nowhere to hide. The element of surprise had worked in the Deathworlders' favor, but now they had to finish what they started. As the first wave of raiders made a desperate push to break through the lines, Cal's forces responded with deadly efficiency. Blasters flashed in the dusty air, and the sound of weapons discharging was deafening. But the Deathworlders didn't fight recklessly. Every shot was aimed with precision, every move calculated. They didn't want to destroy the raiders. They wanted to cripple them, to show that this would not be a battle they could win. Vaughn, leading his own squad of elite warriors, charged forward, his energy blade cutting through the air with a hum. The raiders didn't stand a chance. They were outnumbered, outclassed, and outmatched in every way. Yet the raiders were far from giving up. The sounds of battle echoed across the barren landscape, but even as their numbers dwindled, they fought with a kind of desperation that was almost admirable. The leader, now surrounded, faced Cal, his eyes wild with rage. "You think you've won?" The raider leader sneered, spitting blood onto the ground. "You're just another predator, like the rest of us. You'll see, there's always someone stronger." Cal stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. His calm demeanor, even in the heat of battle, was terrifying. The raider leader sneered, but Cal's gaze locked onto him with an intensity that made the other fighter freeze. "I don't need to prove my strength to you," Cal said, his voice low and cold. "But I will make sure that you never harm anyone again." With that, the Deathworlders' warriors moved in, and the raider leader's fate was sealed. He and his remaining forces were taken prisoner, not killed, but captured, to be taken back for questioning. Cal had no desire to destroy. He wanted to show them mercy, but he would make sure they understood the gravity of their actions. As the battle came to an end, the dust settled, and the raiders were either captured or forced to retreat. The colony of Zephyr 9 was safe, but the cost of the battle was clear. The Deathworlders had acted, but at what cost? Cal stood silently, looking over the battlefield, the silence now heavier than before. This was the first strike. It had been swift, precise, and successful. But Cal couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The galaxy was changing, and so were the Deathworlders. The question remained: would they ever be able to return to their peaceful ways, or had they crossed a line they could never undo? In the distance, the last of the raider ships limped into space, disappearing into the darkness. The Deathworlders had won this battle, but the war, it seemed, was only just beginning. Allies turned away. The battle was over. The dust settled over the wreckage of the raiders' fleet, and the silence that followed was chilling. The Deathworlders had done what they set out to do: protect Zephyr 9 and show the galaxy that they were no longer a race to be trifled with. But as Cal and his warriors surveyed the aftermath, an uneasy feeling lingered in the air. They had succeeded, yes, but there was a price to be paid. As the victorious Deathworlders began to tend to the wounded and prepare for their return to their homeworld, the first signs of trouble began to show. It wasn't the raiders who worried Cal anymore. It was what the raid would mean for their place in the galaxy. The Deathworlders had broken their long-standing rule of peace. They had crossed a line, and even as their forces moved back to their ships, the eyes of the galaxy were upon them. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, Kale received troubling news. Communications from some of their oldest allies were coming in, and they were not the words of praise or relief that Kale had expected. Instead, the messages were filled with hesitation, doubt, and even fear. Kale, Lyra's voice crackled over the comms. The Srith Empire just pulled out of the peace treaty. They've called for an emergency summit. They're distancing themselves from us. Kale's grip tightened on the arm of his command chair. The Srith were one of their oldest allies, a peaceful species known for their vast knowledge and diplomatic influence. They had always shared the same ideals as the Deathworlders: cooperation, harmony, and unity. Now, just days after the battle, they were pulling away, questioning the Deathworlders' actions. "What are they saying?" Kale asked, though he already feared the answer. Lyra hesitated. "They're frightened. They see us as a threat now. They think we've lost our way. They think we've become just another war-hungry species." Kale's voice was low, filled with an anger he hadn't expected to feel. "After all we've done for them, after everything we've built together." Lyra's voice softened. "I understand. They're afraid, Kale, and they're not alone. The other races, those who once called us allies, are now questioning their relationships with us. The Galactic Council is already calling an emergency meeting to discuss the Deathworlder threat. They've seen our actions, and now they're worried we're no better than the very enemies we fought against." Kale stood in silence, staring at the star streaks outside the window of his command ship. He had known this could happen. He had known it deep down. The galaxy wasn't ready for the Deathworlders to be anything other than peaceful guardians. But he hadn't realized just how fragile their alliances were. They were nothing more than paper, easily torn when tested by real conflict. "What should we do?" Lyra asked, sensing the turmoil in Kale's voice. "We can't undo what we've done, but we can still shape what happens next." Kale closed his eyes. For the first time since he had made the decision to strike, he questioned it. Was it worth it? Had they gone too far? "We must make our position clear," Kale said at last, his voice steady, though a sense of uncertainty lingered. "We won't back down. But we will do whatever it takes to prove that we are not a threat. We'll show them that we acted out of necessity, not out of bloodlust. We need to make it clear that we are not the enemy." He knew the road ahead would be difficult. Their peaceful reputation was shattered, and their alliances were fraying. The Deathworlders had chosen to defend themselves, but in doing so, they had unintentionally sent a message to the galaxy, one that wasn't easily misunderstood. They were no longer the guardians of peace. They had become warriors in the eyes of the galaxy. Days later, Kale stood before the Galactic Council. The council chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of species, each eyeing the Deathworlders with suspicion. The room was silent as Kale stepped forward, the weight of the galaxy pressing down on him. The Srith ambassador, a tall, silver-skinned figure with a long, flowing robe, was the first to speak. His voice was filled with both sorrow and caution. "We come here today, not to condemn you, Kale, but to understand. The Deathworlders, your race, have always been our allies, the protectors of peace. But now we are afraid. You've shown us your power, and we no longer know where your loyalties lie." Kale stood tall, his eyes scanning the room. "I understand your fear. We acted in defense of our people. We did not seek war, nor do we want it. But we will no longer stand by and watch others suffer, even if it means changing how the galaxy views us." The room was tense. Representatives from several other species began to speak, voicing their concerns, accusing the Deathworlders of abandoning their peaceful nature. But as the hours passed, something unexpected happened. One by one, members of the council began to speak in favor of the Deathworlders, acknowledging their right to defend themselves. It was the beginning of a long, uncertain path, one where the Deathworlders had to prove that they were not just warriors, but also guardians of the galaxy, willing to fight when necessary, but always striving for peace. Kale left the council meeting with mixed emotions. They had survived this trial, but they had lost much along the way. The galaxy had turned its back on them, and it would take more than just words to restore their reputation. It would take actions, further sacrifices, further proof that the Deathworlders were not the monsters some believed them to be. And yet, as he looked out at the stars, Kale realized one undeniable truth. The Deathworlders had changed, and so too had their place in the galaxy. There was no going back now. The galaxy would never look at them the same way again, and neither would they. The price of peace. The chamber fell into a heavy silence as Cal's words echoed in the air. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like 1,000 stars. The Deathworlders had once been seen as neutral, steadfast guardians, but now they stood on the precipice of becoming something entirely different, something the galaxy wasn't sure it could accept. The Srith ambassador's voice broke the silence. Kale, you speak of defense, but your actions have stirred something far deeper. The Galactic Council fears the repercussions of your choice. You have given the galaxy a reason to see you as more than just protectors, but as potential conquerors. A species with such power, when cornered, could easily become a threat to the very peace we fought for. Kel's gaze remained unwavering. We did not seek conflict, Ambassador. Our people were attacked, and we responded. We defended ourselves and those we've sworn to protect. We did not initiate this, but we will not allow our enemies to view our kindness as weakness. The ambassador's expression softened, but his concern remained. And yet, you are now at the heart of a dangerous paradox. The very thing that made you strong, your ability to show mercy, has now been called into question. If you continue down this path, what will your legacy be? A race that defended peace, or one that brought war upon the galaxy? Lara, standing beside Kale, met his eyes and then spoke. We are not asking for forgiveness. We are not here to beg for our reputation to be restored. But we are here to make one thing clear. We will not be passive in the face of injustice. We've been patient for so long, but the time for patience has ended. We will protect our own, and we will make it clear that we will not stand by and let our enemies win. The room stirred with murmurs of agreement and dissent. The Deathworlders' message was clear. If the galaxy wanted to view them as peaceful guardians, they would have to earn that trust back. But the galaxy was not a forgiving place. There was always a price to pay, and the cost for stepping into the ring of conflict was steep. Kale stood tall. We are not looking for war, but we will not turn our backs on those who are in need. If that means changing how others view us, then so be it. The Deathworlders will stand as they always have, strong, capable, and determined to ensure that the helpless are protected. The room remained uneasy, but Kale could feel the tension begin to shift. Perhaps it wasn't just fear they were feeling. Perhaps there was respect growing behind their suspicion. The galaxy had long relied on the Deathworlders for peace, but peace had come at a price of complacency. The galaxy was waking up to the realization that peace could not always be maintained with kindness alone. As the council session ended and the representatives filed out, Kale found himself alone in the chamber, his mind heavy with the weight of the decision he had made. His people had acted with honor, but the consequences of that action were not yet clear. What had they started? Lara joined him, her steps quiet as she approached. Do you think we've done the right thing? She asked softly. Kale stared out of the massive windows, watching the stars flicker in the distance. I don't know. But I do know one thing. We can't go back. We can't pretend that everything will go back to how it was. We've shown the galaxy who we are, and now we must face the consequences. You've always said we should choose our battles carefully, Lyra said. But sometimes, choosing not to fight is the real danger. And maybe the galaxy needed to see that. The peaceful races, the ones that want to live without conflict, they need to know that there's a price for their inaction. Kale nodded slowly. Perhaps we've become something the galaxy wasn't ready for, but maybe this is what it takes for them to understand what true peace means. You can't protect the weak without making yourself a target, And sometimes, to defend others, you have to be willing to fight. Lara's eyes gleamed with a quiet understanding. It's not the war they fear. It's the fact that they've never seen us as something other than caretakers. Now that they've seen our claws, they're not sure they like what they've discovered. Kale turned to face her. We can't worry about their fear. We must do what's right. We must show them that we are not just a race of warriors, but a people willing to do what it takes to protect what matters. The days that followed were filled with tension. The Deathworlders had left the council chamber, but the repercussions of their actions were far from over. The HFY, once their closest allies, had grown distant, pulling back from joint ventures and distancing themselves from Kel's people. Other races, those who had once held the Deathworlders in high regard, began to question their trust. The galaxy was filled with whispers and doubts. But there was also a shift, a subtle change in the way some viewed the Deathworlders. In the Outer Rim, where the galaxy's forgotten and oppressed lived, there was a growing respect. The news of Zephyr-9's defense spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the fact that the Deathworlders had struck back, it was how they had done it. They had struck quickly, decisively, and without hesitation. The raiders, who had once terrorized entire systems, had been crushed beneath the weight of their own greed. The Deathworlders had sent a message, and that message was echoing across the galaxy. Not all wars were fought with weapons alone. Sometimes, the greatest weapon was the willingness to stand firm when everyone else turned away. As Kel gazed out at the stars once more, he realized the full scope of what they had done. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was theirs to walk. The galaxy had seen the Deathworlders as pacifists, and they had come to rely on that perception. But now, the Deathworlders had given them a new truth. They would not be passive in the face of injustice, and they would no longer be weak in the eyes of those who sought to exploit the helpless. And with that realization, Kel knew one thing above all: the Deathworlders had become something new, something both feared and respected, and that in itself was enough. A new path. The galaxy was changing. The Deathworlders had set the wheels of transformation into motion, but they were not the only ones feeling the shift. As the days passed, Kel found himself torn between his duty to his people and the increasing uncertainty that surrounded them. The once clear path of peace had splintered into multiple roads, each fraught with its own dangers and unknowns. The Galactic Council had convened again, this time with the Deathworlders in the spotlight. There was no applause, no recognition of their bravery. Instead, the eyes of the galaxy burned with distrust and wariness. Kel could feel it. Every word he spoke, every decision he made, was now being scrutinized under a microscope. The Deathworlders were no longer seen as guardians. They were potential threats, and that fear was being stoked in every corner of the galaxy. But Kel refused to back down. He would not let fear control his people. He stood before the council, his expression unwavering despite the tension in the room. This time, the representatives had come with demands that Kel and his people knew would be difficult to meet. "We are here today, Kel," the Vrexian ambassador began, his sharp, reptilian eyes fixed on the Deathworlder leader, "to discuss the future of the Deathworlders in the Galactic Order. Your actions on Zephyr-9 have shaken the core of our alliance. The HFY, and now the Ceruleans, have expressed concerns. You have changed the balance." Kel's eyes flicked to the Sirith ambassador, who stood in silence, his silver skin shimmering with discomfort. The Ceruleans, a proud warrior race who had once admired the Deathworlders' strength, were now silent, their faces betraying nothing but cold calculation. "I understand the fear that my people have caused," Kel said, his voice steady, but his mind racing. "But let me make this clear. We are not a threat to the galaxy. We are not here to conquer or dominate. We are here to protect, and we will protect no matter what it costs." "But at what cost to the galaxy?" the Vrexian countered. "You cannot act without considering the consequences of your actions. If the galaxy perceives you as a force to be reckoned with, you will have enemies on all sides. And if your allies turn against you, there is little you can do to stop it." Kale felt the weight of the Vrexians' words like a blade. It was true. Without their allies, without their networks of trade, resources, and military support, the Deathworlders could easily find themselves isolated and alone in a galaxy that now saw them as potential conquerors. "I know the risks," Kale replied, "and we will face them head-on. But our people cannot live in fear, hiding behind the pretense of peace. We must defend what is ours. If the galaxy does not understand that, then we will make them." There was a long, tense silence. Lyra, standing beside Kale, exchanged a look with him. The decision had already been made, but they knew that the road ahead was fraught with peril. The Deathworlders would need to walk alone, at least for a while, but that did not mean they were without hope. The Vrexian ambassador leaned forward. "You will not be able to walk this path alone, Kale. The Council is prepared to offer you a choice. You can either retract your actions on Zephyr 9, return to the path of diplomacy, and reinstate the peace accords, or we will be forced to consider a more aggressive response. A race like yours, powerful yet unpredictable, cannot be allowed to destabilize the peace we have worked for." Kale's heart beat heavily in his chest. He could feel the pressure mounting. There was no way to retract what had been done. The Deathworlders had shown the galaxy their strength, and in doing so, they had broken something they could never repair. The galaxy would never view them the same again. But Kale was resolute. They could not go back to hiding in the shadows of peace. "Then we will face the consequences," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "But we will not back down. The Deathworlders will stand on their own. If the galaxy cannot accept that, then we will find a way to carve our own path forward." The Council murmured, uncertain but unwilling to challenge Kale directly. The decision had been made. The Deathworlders would not return to the quiet shadows of diplomacy. Instead, they would embrace their newfound strength, and the galaxy would have to adjust to the reality of a species no longer bound by the chains of idealistic peace. As Kale returned to his ship, his mind was a swirl of thoughts. The Council's decision had been made, but it felt like they were standing on the edge of a precipice. The Deathworlders had stepped into a new era, one where they could no longer afford to be passive. They had shown their power, they had shown their resolve. But what would be the cost of walking this new path? Lyra met him on the bridge, her face serious. "You've made the decision, Kale. There's no turning back." "I know," he replied, his voice a mixture of determination and doubt. "But the question remains, will the galaxy accept us for who we are? Or will they see us as a threat, a force to be contained?" "We don't need their acceptance," Lyra said, her eyes steady. "We need their understanding. And if they refuse to understand, then we'll show them what it means to stand in our way." Kale looked out at the stars, his thoughts lost in the infinite expanse before him. There were no easy answers. But there was one truth that had been made clear over the last few days. The galaxy had always underestimated the Deathworlders, and now they would be forced to recognize them, not as mere caretakers, but as a force to be reckoned with. The path ahead was uncertain, and the road would be long and difficult. But Kale knew one thing for sure: the Deathworlders would not be silent anymore. They had been peaceful once, but peace had come with a price. Now it was time to fight for what they had lost, and to protect those who needed them most. With that, Kale turned to face his crew, his warriors, and his people. "Prepare for what's next. The galaxy will soon know what it means to challenge the Deathworlders, and we will stand together." The journey of the Deathworlders was far from over. Their story had only just begun, and the universe had no idea what was coming. A new dawn. The stars beyond the viewport of Kale's ship gleamed with a cold, distant light. He stood alone in the command room, staring at the vastness of space, as if seeking answers from the infinity beyond. The galaxy, once a place of hope and peace for his people, now felt like a battleground, its alliances crumbling, its future uncertain. The choice had been made, and Kale knew it was one that could not be undone. But as the weight of the galaxy's gaze bore down on him, he wondered if they had made the right choice, or if they were already too late. The Deathworlders had never wanted war. For centuries they had stayed in the shadows, protecting those who could not protect themselves, hoping that peace would prevail. But now, after the battle on Zephyr 9 and the Council's ultimatum, the Deathworlders were no longer seen as mere caretakers. They had been forced to reveal their claws, and in doing so, they had forever altered the galaxy's perception of them. Captain Kale, a voice broke through his thoughts. It was Lyra, standing at the doorway, her expression unreadable. The fleet is ready. We're ready to leave the Council's domain and chart our own course. Kale turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. He knew what she meant. The Deathworlders had made their decision. They would no longer be bound by the fragile webs of diplomacy. They would carve their own path, regardless of who stood in their way. We can't go back, can we? Kale said softly, as if speaking to himself more than to Lyra. The galaxy will never see us the same way again. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. No, we can't go back. But maybe that's for the best. Maybe the galaxy needed to see us for who we truly are, not just protectors, but warriors. We've been too passive for too long. The time for sitting in the shadows has passed. Kale looked out the window again, his gaze hardening. I thought we could change things, Lyra. I thought we could show the galaxy that there was another way. But now, they see us as a threat. Lyra's voice was firm, unshaken. And maybe that's the only way they'll understand. We didn't want this, Kale. We didn't want to fight. But sometimes, standing by in silence is the greatest betrayal. We had to act, and we did. We've made our choice. Now we must live with it. Kale nodded slowly. He had always known that their power would eventually be a double-edged sword. It had always been easy to be the peaceful protectors, to stand back and let others fight their battles. But the Deathworlders' strength, the very thing that had kept them safe for so long, had become a burden. In protecting others, they had become too predictable, too dependent on the belief that their pacifism would keep the galaxy at peace. Now the galaxy had seen the true extent of their power, and it had feared them for it. Where do we go from here? Kale asked. Lyra's expression softened. We lead. We stand tall and show the galaxy that we will not back down. We may have lost some allies, but we have gained something far more important, the truth. We know who we are now, and the galaxy will learn to respect that. The room was silent for a moment as Kel processed her words. It was true. They had shown their strength, but in doing so, they had exposed their vulnerability. The galaxy now viewed them through a lens of fear and suspicion, but perhaps that fear was the price they had to pay to finally be seen as equals in the universe. No longer would they be overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, and moments later, Vaughn, the Deathworlder general, entered, his broad form casting a long shadow in the doorway. The fleet is ready to depart, Vaughn said, his voice calm but serious. The Council is still watching, Kale. The galaxy is watching. Kale turned to face him, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in his chest. The decisions they had made had set the course for the Deathworlders' future, but it was a future they could no longer control. They had drawn a line in the sand, and now they would have to live with the consequences. We leave today, Kale said, his voice steady. But we don't leave as fugitives or outcasts. We leave as the Deathworlders, those who protect, those who fight, and those who will never back down. Lyra nodded in agreement. It's not about escaping the galaxy's judgment, Kale. It's about shaping a future where we no longer have to hide, where we no longer have to play the role with peacekeepers. We will protect, yes, but we will also demand respect. From now on, we fight on our terms. As the fleet of ships lifted off from the planet, leaving the remains of the Galactic Council behind, Kale felt the weight of a new responsibility settling over him. He was no longer just the leader of a peaceful race, a guardian of quiet diplomacy. He was now a symbol of strength, of defiance, and of the unwavering will to protect those who could not protect themselves. He turned to face the vastness of space once again, a place both infinite and full of untold dangers. The Deathworlders had always been a force of nature, But now they would embrace that power. There was no more pretending. There would be no more hiding behind the veil of peace. They would show the galaxy that they were no longer the passive protectors. They were warriors in their own right, standing tall among the stars. As the fleet entered hyperspace, leaving the familiar planets of the galaxy behind, Cal's resolve hardened. The road ahead would be treacherous, and the galaxy would never see them the same again. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was time for the Deathworlders to carve their own future. The galaxy had learned to fear them, and in time, it would learn to respect them. This was just the beginning. The Deathworlders had stepped into a new era, one where their claws were no longer hidden in the shadows. And as they charted their own course, they would never again be afraid to defend what was theirs.